and gentlemen, and I think we're going to have some slides in a moment. I've always wanted to come up to a lectern with a couple of sort of tomes, so I know it's the 4:30 sort of graveyard session of a conference, so if I start at the beginning and if I read all the way through the books, I'm sure you'll be happy with that. That's a joke, by the way. I'm Leanne Tritton, I'm the chair of the London Society, and I'm really grateful to LREF for giving us this opportunity to talk about a really important publication that is coming out in the next couple of weeks. And I'm slightly nervous about our panel who'll be reviewing. They've all had early copies of the publication to look at, to review it and give some of their feedback. So I'm looking forward to that. But before I start, I just wanted to give you some background on the London Society because it sounds incredibly important and it is an amazing organisation. And I've been involved in the last 2 years, and every day I'm learning more about the work that we have done. So for those of you who don't know, it was the first chair was Sir Aston Webb, and also Lutyens was one of the founding members. And a lot of people don't realise that Harry Gordon Selfridge, the great retailer, was also one of the founding members. And I think Neil Chassor sums it up very, very succinctly in the book when he says the London Society was a motley crew of progressives drawn from architecture and the wider civic society. And I think that sort of speaks to us all. I certainly feel like a bit of a motley crew now, and I'm really delighted that we're part of this amazing organisation. So when it was established in 1912, the core aim was to look after the old, seek the beautiful, and cultivate the future. And the organisation was incredibly powerful. So if you look here, you can see the London Society's development plan of Greater London, and that was published in 1919. And it was incredibly powerful and influential in creating change in London. And large parts of it were adopted by Abercrombie's Great London Plan in 1944. And I hope that after today you will feel that you can get involved in the society and be equally influential and powerful in terms of thought leadership. So where we are at the moment, the London Society, we're a membership organisation and we value the past but look to the future, which is really important. And our aim is to translate and bring clarity to very complex issues that are facing the built environment. And I think that speaks to all of us. I mean, listening to a lot of the panel sessions today, one of our biggest issues that we have is explaining to the general public how our world works and why we go about things in the way we do. And our aim is to simplify those messages and make it easier for people to understand. Importantly, we're a charity, so we have little money, but I'll come back to that later on. We're also a civic society, and when I first got involved in the London Society, I thought it was a bit old-fashioned. A civic society, what is that? Sort of bunch of old people meeting up to discuss things. But in fact, as I've looked at politics, at all sorts of things happening in our world at the moment, I'm absolutely wedded to the idea of a civic society having huge amounts of power and influence in shaping our outcomes. Also importantly, because we have very little money, we're independent, and that's something that I'd like to appeal to you all today. I know most of you are sitting here and you all have jobs to do, and you can't always say what you want to say in terms of your professional lives. But the London Society can. We can be a provocateur and get things done. And I would like all of you to consider us being your partner in starting those debates and conversations. So in 1921, the London Society Committee and trustees felt similarly to the way we feel now, and that is that they needed to shape how London was going. They were very unhappy with development, all of the major issues we've got now, transport, air pollution, all of those sorts of things. And so they took it upon themselves to publish this amazing, amazing book called London of the Future, and I'm one of the very few people lucky enough to have an original copy. But in this book are a whole range of essays and discussions about what London could be. Now, some of them are quite mad, and some of them are brilliant. And we've seen things like the Green Belt, Channel Tunnel, all of those sorts of things come out of this conversation that started in the book. So last year, the London Society trustees I guess we were all concerned, as we've heard today, we're all dealing with a bit of crisis with leadership. And we wanted to revisit the London of the future, the idea that we could come up with ideas and start a conversation about London of the future. And so we're just about to launch on October the 17th our new publication. Sorry, I feel like this is the one. You can buy it next week. It's available from our website and from all good bookstores. But most importantly, it is about ideas for London. And when we talk about London, we're not just, London is a major city in the UK. So if you solve things here, often you can solve them elsewhere. So I would urge anyone involved in cities to get a copy of this book and look at what can be done and the ideas within it. I've added on the right-hand side there some of the people who've funded this book, because, as I say, we started off pretty much with no funds at all. But we're so incredibly grateful for not only the sponsors, but the individuals who've put their money where their mouth is or where their heart is and funded the book. So, as well as over 200 individuals who gave money through a crowdfunding campaign. This is a list of the contributors with all the chapters, and you'll be able to read them when you buy a copy of the book. We can't give it all away. But again, we're incredibly grateful for this very diverse range of people who took their time at no fee to come up with ideas and really think carefully about where London was going. Oops. So, money. We have no money. We are a charity that absolutely runs on the sniff of an oily rag. I mean, I can tell you, if you want to talk to people who run very lean organisations, come and have a chat to us at the London Society. And so normally when I get to this part of the presentation, I beg for money. So it'd be wrong for me not to beg for money. So please let us know if you can support us. We do have corporate sponsorships. But more importantly today, I think in line with what we're talking about is the plea for leadership. And one of the great things about the London Society with our trustees, our volunteers, people who come together and do all of this work for free, is they're showing leadership in all sorts of different ways. And I think that sometimes we get bogged down in this idea that leadership is political. You have to be a politician. You don't. You can be a leader in all sorts of ways. And so we have an amazing team of next generation people. I think I'm mid-generation. But, these are the people, all of us here, I make a plea to you to get involved in London, because we can't leave it to our political leaders. They're not doing a good enough job. And so we have to return to the roots of the London Society and take these ideas on ourselves. So within the book, we have a whole range of essays and ideas, but that's only the start of it. And we would ask you as well to, if you have an idea or you have an idea of how to take something within this book forward, please come forward and get involved. I think this is quite important, as I say, in terms of next gen, and all of us really. None of us started out as leaders. You're not born a leader. We all set an example to everybody we work with, everyone we talk to, and the way we communicate the work we do to the general communities. And I know that's been a big theme today. But what I would say is, think back to what you can do in any shape and how we mirror good behaviours to all of the people around us, and not only children, by the way. I've added this image in here just as an illustration, really, of the ways you can get involved. So Chris Hopkinson is a young photographer. He doesn't earn a huge amount of money, but he always donates his time and his energy to the London Society. And to me, he's a leader. He's a leader in his field by doing that. And so any way you can show that leadership, small or large, please get involved. And then this final image is a wonderful shot he took of a Chelsea pensioner looking over the Wilkinson Air building. And we're talking about Next Gen this afternoon, but it's for every generation. And I don't think that we should just give the responsibility to the next generation and say it's your problem. We all have to work together on this. So if you're alive, you can still help and you can still have an influence. So keep going, you're not dead yet. And all presentations have to end with the announcement of a podcast. In this day and age. And so next week we will be launching a new podcast series from the London Society called London Explained. And what we're doing is we're taking areas of London that are undergoing massive change and trying to explain the journey they've been on. And some of you may know our co-trustee, Dave Hill, who runs On London, and he is the presenter of the podcast series, and it's being produced by a BBC producer called Andrew McGibbon, and it is absolutely fantastic. And I'm incredibly proud of how it's going to influence, I hope, people when they listen to our sector and what we're doing. So that's it from me, and over to Kat and the panel, and I've got to give you the remote control, and let's hope they like the book.
Been done already, amazing. Thank you so much, Leanne. My name's Kat Hannah. I'm sitting here with about 3 hats on. I'm a director at Avison Young. I'm also a trustee of the London Society, and a quick plug for the book. Also, I have a chapter in it, so you should definitely go read it so you can tell me how all the predictions I've got are going to be completely wrong. But thirdly, and I think probably particularly relevant for today, is that I am chair of the NLA Next Gen Committee, which is basically why I have this sort of, someone described them earlier as my army of young people, which kind of sounds quite exciting. You know, I feel like we're sitting here a bit like the UN. But really, what is this about? Well, I think, you know, Leanne's presentation and I think her comments on leadership had me thinking before about, you know, what do we mean when we're thinking about future leaders? And I'm always slightly worried, the word future or next gen is sort of like, when you get to that next stage, that's when you're ready to be leading. And actually, I think what really inspires me about next gen and the cohort is these are people that are actually already leading. They're not waiting to be told. They're people that are identifying problems and leaning into solving them. And I think that's something that we can all learn from, that it's not, this is an issue for our leaders to sort. It is something that if you're getting involved in solving a problem, you are already leading. And I think the other thing that I think it would be, you know, remiss not to remark on is, look, the book from the 1920s is amazing. If you're kind of a policy nerd, particularly the chapter on the Channel Tunnel is amazing. Some excellent diagrams in there as well. But it would be remiss not to notice, obviously, that whilst there may have been a bit of a progressive ragtag bunch, they share quite a few characteristics, among them broadly being white, male, relatively old, and sporting a fine moustache. And, you know, the look of these people and the ideas that they include in the book do very much reflect the milieu in which it was written. But actually, similarly, I think, so does the new book. There's a lot more focus on collective leadership, on skills, on sustainability, on communities, all themes that I think our future leaders are going to bring out as we talk about now. So again, thinking about that leadership again in the broader way possible. Not people that necessarily fit that mould, especially the kind of very old school mould that we've seen in some of the leaders of the London Society, but actually people who are already leading without waiting to be given that title to do so. So that's just a few kind of opening remarks from me. Before we get into the kind of the panel discussion, I do have a question that I'd like to ask you all. So using Slido, I'm going to do a bit of, anyone who knows me knows I generally like to do a bit of a temperature check with panels. So the first one is, how do you feel about the future of London? How positive, optimistic are we feeling? Or are we feeling pretty neutral? Or by this stage in the day, are we all a bit jaded and ready for a drink? So that poll is now activated. We should be able to have the events shared. If not, I will I will read them out, but I'll give people a few more seconds to log in and to do that. And then I'm going to come back, and hopefully you will be feeling that the future is in good hands, and you'll be feeling at least a little bit inspired by what people have had to say. Okay, so far we're on about 50% optimistic, 27% neutral, 27% pessimistic. That is changing with a degree of consistency, still looking at about half the room feeling optimistic. So let's see how that goes. So I'm going to begin by asking the panelists today to really do two things. They've had the privilege of the advanced copy of the book, and to think either, what did it make you think about your vision for London? And was there anything you read in any chapter that was particularly compelling or that really interested you? So I'm going to begin with Evie.
So my vision for the future of London is utopian. I like to think optimistically about the future, and I think that's partly because I'm slightly biased. So I am a Londoner, I was born and raised here, I'm very passionate about London. My vision for the future is one where there's equal opportunity for all, and in particular for young people. So what do I mean by that? Well, I mean, I want to bridge that gap between those young people that think construction is nothing more than just a man in a hard hat, and those that are around this room that know that it is so much more. So for myself, for example, I went to quite a run-of-the-mill state school. I didn't have anyone coming into my school talking about the benefits of a career in the real estate environment. I pretty much ended up working in real estate by chance. And while there are fantastic initiatives such as the LREF School Engagement Programme, which focuses on specifically going into schools and talking about what a benefit it is to go into a career like this, I think in 100 years' time, we'll be able to do so much more, because we won't just be targeting a few schools in London, we'll be able to target every single school in London, and we'll have holograms that talk about the benefits of a career in the real estate environment. And they'll be talking about the fact that it's not just a specific discipline, it's not just finance or engineering, although some of the people in this room might butcher me after this for that. It's all around us. It's the ground that we walk on, it's the quality of the air that we breathe. And I think having a wider talent pool to choose from in future is going to set us up well for dealing with the societal challenges that we'll face in 100 years' time.
Thanks, Evie, and I think we'll be coming back to that point about talent and breadth of talent as well. I want to bring in Emma to talk a bit about a chapter that I know you found particularly stimulating.
The chapter that I sort of felt most resonated with me was on the City of High Streets. And so as a transport planner, that's kind of our bread and butter, looking at the spaces that people use every day and how they use them. So there are a few interesting facts that I just want to pull out, but not spoilers, I promise. So there's 600 high streets in London, and if you were to put them all back to back, they would cover 310 miles, which is the equivalent of going from Highbury Corner to the Scottish borders. So I think they're often overlooked spaces, and there's been a lot of talk lately about the decline of high streets, but I think we need to put a different spin on them, and we need to look at how actually they can really serve the future of London and how they can become a space where you meet friends, where you socialise, where you go and do your shopping, whatever it might be. And I think there's a lot of promise at the moment, on an optimistic note, in terms of changing the way that we do development in London, looking more at active frontages, kind of having that spill out from the ground floor and not just being a sort of fortress building with these massive receptions that, can feel quite closed off. And kind of coming to Evie's point, I feel like that can kind of sometimes make younger people feel a bit excluded from real estate. And so opening up in sort of both the physical way that we build our buildings, but also in how that we kind of reach out to people is something that was really important in the future of London.
Brilliant, thanks Emma. And I'm going to bring in Fred now, because Fred, you looked a bit really about some chapters that talks about housing, but also about sustainability as well. So what particularly interested you?
So yeah, I had a more general look at the book, and I have to say I didn't come up with what I think the world or what London will be like in 100 years, but there were some really interesting points that I read through. I started off reading the chapter Wrap It Up and Start Again, which is about housing within London by Claire Benny, and I was ready to rail against everything she said and was countering all of her arguments, and then read a bit further down and totally agreed with pretty much everything she said. But one point she made was that she thought it was difficult to look forward from this vantage point of where we are now, where we're coming out of the pandemic, where we are dealing with Brexit and with a certain amount of political instability, that it's difficult to look forward. But then further down talks about the paramount things that we should be looking at when we're building and designing housing, which is affordability and sustainability. And I think I just think it's a really important point to not let ourselves get away with not doing things because we say, oh, it's difficult now, or, you know, I could do it later, but to always have those ideas, affordability and sustainability, at the forefront of what we're doing and factoring it into everything we're doing. There was another thing which actually I did disagree with in what she said, which was that apartment buildings can be energy hungry, and it seemed like it was a foregone conclusion that if you build high-density housing, it's going to use up a lot of energy and it's going to be a negative thing in terms of sustainability. But we have the standards. We've come together as an industry in certain ways within projects, outside of projects, to work out what a net zero building looks like, to work out what a carbon negative building looks like, and we can achieve this with high density housing, low density housing. We just need to put it into practice. So I thought that was just an interesting point to look at. And
I'm going to pause you there, just
much.
because, one, you warned me you would speak for a long time, so I thought I'd jump in. But I wanted to bring in Alla, because, you know, Alla, you looked at a chapter that talks about moving towards a regenerative London. Yeah. And I think, again, some of these principles around sustainability, both in terms of what we build that's new, but actually how we reuse what we've got, came out in that chapter. So do you want to share some of your thoughts?
Yeah, I think one of the main points of the chapter is the idea of community and collaboration. A lot of the time within the built environment and through my time in practice, we do tend to work a lot in silos, and we don't engage as much as we should be with the communities that we're trying to develop or trying to improve. And part of the regenerative process, we speak a lot about urban renewal, gentrification. In concept, they're great concepts, but when they're put into actual practice, they are not as good as they should be. London is, in my opinion, what makes it special is that it is a multicultural metropolis, against what has been currently said in the news by certain people, but that is something that makes it a really great city to live in and a great city to progress in. And I think we need to hone in more on that, and the fact that we're able to bring different communities together and to bring different professions together and sit under one roof and try and figure out what is needed and what needs to be improved and what the future needs to look like, not just for us or for the generation above us, but also for the generation that's about to enter the world or enter into this market and this profession. So the chapter that I was reading, it was really honing in on different points that we need to start looking at critically. We need to start looking at the climate as it's an urgency. It's happening right now. It might not be happening directly at our border, but it is happening around us, and we are feeling effects of that. So policies need to be put in place so that we're able to tackle that and to mitigate the effects that will happen within the next couple of years, let alone in the next 100 years. If we're looking as well in terms of waste management, we do a lot of work in architecture in the built environment of trying to rehabilitate buildings, regenerate buildings, but how are we doing that in a way where we are minimizing the amount of waste we're using to sort of reduce that carbon footprint that we are creating, and what is necessary versus what is not necessary, and how are we making our clients and specifically developers sort of aware of the incentives that are out there. I've had a background in real estate development, and I was really interested in it while I was in architecture school and architecture practice, because there is a miscommunication between the professions. So how are we engaging more from the beginning of a project, not just with the client, not just with the communities that we're in, but also the people that are developing those communities, and showing the positive outlooks down the line which will have a bigger impact than just sort of the short-term immediate goals that they're trying to achieve.
Thanks, Ella. And I think between you and yourself and Fred have picked up something quite interesting about the book, and again, how these books often tend to reflect, again, the scenario or the basis in which they're written as much as they reflect thoughts about the future, which is when confronted with these very immediate feeling challenges around the environment, around cost of living, housing crisis, etc., trying to think about 100 years ahead, let alone trying to say anything with any degree of certainty, actually almost feels even more difficult. So that combined sort of feeling about what is happening almost next week versus that next 100 years is something I think that definitely comes out in the book. I'm going to bring in James now, because again, I think you took kind of some of these quite broad themes, again, around skills, around, who is London for, and drew some ideas from the book. Do you want to share some thoughts about your vision?
No, absolutely, thank you. I think one of the
No, you don't. No.
yeah, one of the big ones is definitely it's kind of such a tough challenge to think 100 years in advance. It's kind of almost we're next generation, but it's next generation. So yeah, it's kind of I was trying to think what you do and how it's such a large piece. I think one of the big pieces, again, as Evie touched on as well, is bringing more people in, making London and also just careers within the built environment, everyone more accessible. And you kind of then think, okay, well, London's going to continue to grow, and definitely as all we'll get outside investment and inside investment. So it's like, how does that look? And I think one of the big ones is kind of making London accessible through D&I and also through just actual transport as well, infrastructure, bringing more and more people to London and making it more and more accessible. But as very much a hot topic and everything, and being discussed quite extensively even today as well, was the sustainability and how that can be kind of done sustainability and done in a sustainable way, and it's quite definitely a challenge, because you want it to be able to keep London growing, but also and making it more accessible, but how we can do that in a sustainable way. So I really like the chapter, which was kind of learning from London's peers, which is a bit an interview from Smith Mordack. Sorry, I got to make sure I got that name correct. And I really like about it is it's kind of straight away that she addresses it's what we need to do. We know what we need to do currently, but it's like how we actually go about that. And what's really nice about it as well is like this isn't a London problem sustainability-wise. It's a worldwide, and we don't need to kind of reinvent the wheel. We can also utilise what's working really well, and even if it's small improvements in other cities and other countries, it's how we can reuse that. So I mean, they pull some really, really great examples, even just going down to kind of Exeter City Council level, so not London, not countrywide.
I'm not going to lie, I did not think Exeter would be the example that would be given of great urban policy. So but it's a really just shows how like small minor changes, and this is kind of driving from almost a government or kind of council level, which is where all their social housing is now, they insisted it to be passive house. By doing so, that led to almost a circa 20% uplift, which is obviously not great, but you kind of sometimes a very common theme, which is usually sustainability comes at a cost. But by enforcing that, the local supply chain managed to improve and create better strategies, better ways of working, and that's now reduced, I think it was, let me get it correct, reduced down to 4%. Which just shows by kind of having that top-down approach of really driving from the government direction, they're able to actually really encourage the whole market. So it's a real combination. It's not solely responsible for the government. It's everyone's responsibility, but it's really interesting to see how, with that assistance, that force from the government-led, also the private sector kind of caught up with it. And that's it, James. You have segued beautifully, and I think without necessarily even knowing it, to Lauren. Because, Lauren, you look at a chapter that looks, again, at sort of what happens with sustainability in London, but this idea of which government is it that's setting those targets, who's really driving that ambition, and what might that mean for the capital? So do you want to tell us a bit about your thoughts on that chapter?
Yeah, so my chapter really looks at what London looks and feels like in 100 years' time. And when I first met Leanne today, she said she loves that chapter. So I really hope that I do a good job, and I hope Mark Stevenson, who wrote it, isn't in the audience, so see how we get on. So the big smoke that we all know and love, the fossil fuel pollution that darkens the sky above us, that's basically how our city is now. And in the future, that they say sustainability is really part and parcel of what London is at the future, and we really are a climate-conscious city and really are a global leader. So the city basically feels really, really different to how it is now. So businesses in Soho are booming under trees. You've got parkland that isn't utilised to its best way now, is now urban farms for local restaurants. The City of London, they say, has evolved drastically, and it's now heavily residential amongst a load of business districts. And this has been really driven by a retrofit boom, which, as Kat was just saying, is a lot to do with legislation changes on net zero carbon, as well as taxation changes, which are really driven by CEOs and celebrities. So the new nickname, so instead of the big smoke, is really driven by how the architecture really visibly changes to Londoners. So imagine the big skyscrapers around London, and those top 20% of the floors are now redundant to residential or office space, and in actual fact now they now have got direct air capture modules to get the CO2 out of the air, and it gets pushed into the ground. So in actually, what goes up must come down really drives the new nickname, which globally we're now known as the drawdown city. So what it says in 100 years' time is that basically London is the new financial centre of a net zero economy, and the big smoke is basically forgotten forever. And I think for me, just the three short things that have come out of today that I've picked up in different sessions are having that long-term view really drives a lot of impact. Collaboration between a number of sectors and a number of people make the difference. And then the third thing is that we've obviously got a lot of crises at the moment going on, as you all know, but actually the environment crisis is major, and the chapter really focuses on that, and that's how we can really make a difference to what London will look like in 100 years.
Thank you, Lauren. That's fantastic. And I think just that summary actually showed the power of a book, and obviously I'm going to be a bit, biased about this one. The power of an amazing book of this, actually, and just that different way of thinking about what if London will be like this, it will smell like that, it will sound like that, this is what it will feel like, this is the policy that's been brought in. It's just a bit of a refreshing way of thinking often to the ways that we're so often used to doing as a sector. And I think that's why, some of it can be quite fun, some of it can be quite challenging, but actually I think, you just did such a good job of evoking the spirit of what a book like this and thinking about the future can really do. Obviously, the book isn't perfect, so I do want to ask the panel, is there anything you felt was missing or maybe a bit underplayed, or that you would have expected to read in a book that was thinking about London in 100 years' time, or anything you read and were like, this is absolute nonsense and will never happen?
I have one. I think I was kind of hoping they would lean into who we would be designing for in 100 years, how London would look like in terms of the demographic and the people living in it. Right now, I think the average age of people living in London is around 36 years old, and it's about 40% who are, or 46% who are from an ethnic background. So, and then I'm not too sure about marital status, but how is that going to change? Because it has changed significantly in the last 20 years. And so, obviously, our profession is designing for people, and places are for people. So I would have liked to see sort of just an idea of how they see that changing, because that would inform or influence sort of what would happen within 100 years.
Interesting. I think we'll come on a bit to the question about demography and how we use that when we're thinking into the future. Anyone else have anything they would challenge or would have liked to have seen? Lauren?
I think when we all looked at it as a panel, the first book that was written was really radical, and actually we all reflected that the second book, it seems like our imagination's gone quite a lot, which I found really interesting. And then the other point that I disagreed, which was mainly in my chapter, was that it basically said at its absolute peak there would be 40% occupancy rates in offices, which I just thought was quite disappointing, because I definitely feel like I have more confidence in London than that, and I think especially our industry has a major role to play in making sure that that doesn't happen. And I think, so I work for Places for London, TfL's property company. If you haven't heard, we're launching today, I'm sure you have now. And
good effort on that final plug, though, well done.
And we've just launched a partnership with Helical to create best-in-class commercial workspace. So I think I have more confidence in the future of London than sometimes some of the chapters set out potentially.
Fantastic. And I think it's a really important reflection. We did have quite a heated discussion, I guess, about the noted lack of what I would call grand projet that are set out in the new book, again, particularly compared to the first one, which was, like you said, quite radical, lots of talk of, lots of machines, lots of big projects. And again, whether that's a good or a bad thing, is it maybe just a reflection that we're thinking about how we do more with less? Is it maybe we're thinking a bit more about, the environment and about people, and a bit less around kind of, machinery and digging tunnels? But yeah, something to think about. And I'm sure also there'll be many agents in the room that will maybe get you a drink later, Lauren, to thank you for the positivity in which we have in the London office sector, including myself. I've got a couple more questions for the panel. As we play those out, just to remind you all, Slido is still open. If you would like to submit a question, you've got some of London's brightest and best young people up here, so please do share your questions with them. I just wanted to come on to a bit how we find space actually to do some of this thinking about the future in our day jobs. Because again, this can be quite fun and quite an interesting intellectual activity to do. You get into the office, it totally goes out the window. So we've got a couple of project managers here in EV, and I think James as well. Is it something you ever find time to do, and is that an issue?
Yeah, it's definitely a good point. I mean, we're all very, very guilty of getting down in the weeds of everything, and it's very easy to get overworked, and on even our project, I'm sure everyone feels that as well. But it's one of those things where it's also in the other way though, I noticed it massively on our projects, when we do take a step back and look further ahead, how much an improvement that is. So I think it's kind of trying to then make the time and focus and do that as well, helps as well. I know also at Mace, we've got really great priorities with the sustainability drive and everything, 2026 strategy. So it's brilliant to have kind of that's also being pushed from all the way at the top level. But even just on a personal level, it's good to kind of always look forward and just kind of, I know the benefits we see in our projects, is also trying to apply that into actually how can we do that within our own roles, and also going into, it got addressed massively early as well in the sustainable construction part. We are a huge part of the impact of the environment. So we can, any minor amendment we can make and small improvements, we don't have to completely change the world, but each little bit will help. So I think it's taking the time. Yeah, and I think that's a really important point, that often taking time to do that does mean a better outcome for the project, even if it might maybe feel like a bit of a distraction or luxury at the time. Evie, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it's really difficult, actually, when you're in the nitty-gritty detail of a project. From my side, as a project manager, dealing with the programme, you can have two sides of that. You can have the firefighting element where you're dealing with a sudden leak on site, and then you can have the actual programme and activity that you're sticking to, which it might be sort of building partition walls on that day. And so it's very difficult to kind of pull yourself away from that and think about the long term of the industry and how your kind of work feeds into that. I think we're really good in terms of sort of thought leadership, and there are some, this is a guilty plug, fantastic thought leadership articles that G&T put out, but I think actually feeding that back into the day-to-day is where we struggle a lot more. And I'd also just like to touch on the cost point, because I think there are a huge number of cost pressures on projects at the moment. So that's, inflation, pushing up the cost of labour, pushing up the cost of materials, also in terms of interest rates, so it's more expensive to borrow. And I think, if anything, with projects, we're trying to de-scope, value engineer, make them more simple, as opposed to kind of darting into the future and thinking about bigger ambitions that we could achieve. Often it's a high upfront cost for a longer term return on investment, and it's difficult to make that stack up at that moment in the time.
Yeah, which is really interesting, because it's back to, again, does thinking to the long term, could that actually help identify means of cost saving over the longer term? If, again, it's done correctly, and it's rather than saying long term means we need to add more, build more into the specification. I want to bring in Emma here, and probably Ala as well, on this point about demographics, because, Emma, you're a transport planner. Mm-hmm. I imagine you actually probably do, I would hope in many ways, you do think about the future and get more, reason to do that in your day job than others. What does that look like, and how do you bring it into the sort of projects you work on?
So in all of our sort of development planning projects, we have to look forward and forecast what the future demand will be in terms of the transport impact. So I think we are quite good at doing that, but we do it quite a lot at the moment in a sort of predict and provide approach. So that's looking at historical trends, and we'll say over the last 5 years, growth has been 5%. So we'll apply that for the next 5 years. And it's sort of then just replicating scenarios that have happened previously. I think we need to move away from predict and provide to decide and provide. So you have a conversation, with the local authorities, with your developers, with clients, and you say, okay, what do you want the future of this area to look like? So, it could be a scenario where, there's no cars, everyone's walking, everyone's cycling. That would be my preference. And then you say, okay, so what do we need to do? What do we need to build in terms of infrastructure? What do we need to do in terms of, footway widening, cycle lanes, things like that to make that scenario happen, implement those changes, and then the growth will come that way. It's sort of, build it and they will come kind of situation in terms of cycle lanes in London. You look at the City of London now, all those changes that have happened there, cycling is now the most popular mode of transport within the square mile. So, those changes can happen if we build that infrastructure and, make the right decisions early on by looking forward.
Yeah, and that's such an interesting example of almost sometimes the limits of being too reliable on just forecasting rather than thinking, actually, again, we're talking today about values. What are the values we're working to and what is it we want to achieve, and then how do we get there? I mean, Alla, you've been you've had quite a few thoughts again about the idea of how we think about populations, communities. How does it work for you in terms of your day job?
I think we focus a lot more on the design side of it, but we do have quite a good sort of back and forth within our studio and within our team. So if we are refurbing a building or rehabilitating one, really what does that look like for those who are passing by, for those who are coming in? We spend a third of our day in offices or at work specifically, and the other third at home, and then you have a third, which is the third space, which is like your recreational activities. And how we design those spaces impacts our mental health, our well-being, it impacts our productivity, and the people that we are surrounded by. There's different age groups, there's different, like you said, it's a vast demographic, and it's constantly changing within London itself. Right now, we have been having these conversations on how does what we're designing or building or constructing right now really stand time and not be just for a specific period of time. We're looking more at sort of long-term impact as opposed to just something that looks good for the term that it's in. It's kind of like the fashion idea that things come in and out of fashion and fast fashion. We've really tried to stay away from that. And a lot of the thought process right now with what we're doing at Buckley Grey Yeoman is we're trying to create a legacy, but we're also trying to create something that can sustain the test of time. Because, like you said, things change, people change, and the world is changing, and how we use these buildings are changing. And so that's really been the interesting side of being within sort of an architecture firm and industry that really does look towards the future and not just the present. I don't know if that answers your question. But
no, it does. It's absolutely fantastic. I was thinking in my head, I'm like, who is the fast fashion of architecture? And I really like that parallel. I'm thinking about, again, back to value and what is it we really get from these buildings. I'm just now going to go to Fred, because when we talked before, you had some quite interesting thoughts, I think, inspired by the book about not just how we as individuals think about the future, but actually how we do it collectively.
Yeah. So I think that was a good thing that was brought up, where in our different disciplines, maybe we look forward more than in others, or you have, it's part of your job, it might be as a project manager, to be looking 15, 30 years into the future. I think often as a designer, I'm a building services and sustainability designer at Introba, we can move from project to project, and we will be thinking about that building and how long it's going to last, what's the environment going to be like within that building in the next 10 years, in the next 15 years. But it can often be that we are significantly limited by the amount of time the building does have to be built, and we've got to design it in the right amount of time, and the amount of money available to build that building, or the amount of money we have available to design it. So it means that we can have some really great ideas on a project basis, which get put into practice, but it needs some more thought. It would be good to be able to explore it and delve into it with a lot of other experts and a lot of other eager people. And that's something that came up in the book in a chapter called Back to the Future by Neil Shazor, where he talks about a built environment fellowship, where rather than being project-based or money-driven or the kind of that silo, you come together as experts in your field. So we could have the project managers, we could have the building services engineers, sustainability, architects, structures, all coming together to work towards a goal together, rather than being on a project pulling in their own specific direction. And there is actually a great example of how positive this can be and how constructive it can be, where there's a an organisation called Letty, who originally, it's a voluntary organisation, and it was originally brought together because of the new London plan and to try and lobby and influence that to make sure that it's as sustainable as possible. And it essentially just it did all of those things. It was industry professionals coming together to try and work out not just how much better can we be than we are now, but what is the aim for what we need to achieve over the next 100 years. And there's one statistic that I thought was really interesting that came from the book and has sat with me since I read it, which was that uninhabitable land globally is set to go from 1% to 19% by 2070, and I just think that's terrifying. So it's kind of a nice thing to think about. We should pull together to try and sort this out, rather than everyone doing different streams separately to try and sort it out.
Thanks, Fred, and I think, it's quite an important point to have today, at the session where, whether it's the NLA and the London Society, the number of other organisations there are, is trying to create something of that fellowship. Is it perfect? Not necessarily, but again, I think are we getting there in that ability to actually genuinely share and collaborate, rather than maybe saying we're doing it, but for reasons of competition or commerciality, keeping some of it back. So just one more plug that we've got Slido, still a bit of a window for Slido questions. The code, I am told, is at the top right of the screen, if you can see it up there, but I have got a few that have come in. And there's one interesting question is that we've talked about, it's from Cal Weaver, I believe, and we've talked about leadership and we've talked about education. What do people think is the role of how you actually educate and train leaders and train people not just to get involved in the built environment, but to actually go into that leadership role? I'm going to go to Evie just because I know you're thinking quite a lot in the skill and learning area.
Yeah, so from my perspective, I think one of the key things that I would like to see more of is getting young people into the boardroom so that they can actually understand how decisions are made at that kind of level. I think secondly, and this is actually something that we do at G&T, more mentoring, especially from sort of senior leaders to young professionals, but also vice versa. So it's quite good to get perspectives from both sides. So it's not just simply telling sort of the young person how to become a leader, but also learning the other way around as well, which I think also helps.
Anyone else have any thoughts about, again, how we engender the next generation of future leaders alongside, initiatives like NextGen?
It is quite a tough one. I think it's a good question. I was thinking how it's where I've had really, I think it stems a lot from really good mentors. Evie touched on really well, and I definitely agree with the boardroom idea as well. And it's there are a lot of really good leaders within the companies, within the whole built environment as well. So it's really starting to I think they're the best people to learn from, but I think it's also a bit of a case of learning, I don't think you have to learn one person's style. I think everyone's got a slightly different style. I remember hearing this from my mentor, which is you might cherry pick the bit you like from them, but that might not be 100% the way you want to do it. So it's kind of taking how, and I think that's quite important, is having a broad range and also understanding different views. So that's where I think kind of having in the diversity, whether it's from where people's backgrounds and everything's really important as well, because everyone's got a slightly different way of looking at things. So it's almost kind of having a cherry pick in the best leadership skills from really good mentors and having that opportunity. But that goes back to the opportunity to meet really good mentors and meet really good leaders. So I think it's about getting as many people in to create that kind of situation for everyone. And again, really important why the diversity is important, because it's learning, like you said, those different skills, those different behaviours from a range of individuals rather than just one person you model it on. Any thoughts down the other end of the table, or can I go to some of our next Slido questions?
Can I add one quick
Go
one?
for it.
So I did a mentorship program for the American Institute of Architects, and they have a specific program, and this one's going really young, so not sort of our age, but it was trying to engage high school students and primary school students into the field of the built environment and specifically architecture. And they we did about one lesson for 6 weeks, 1 hour with these kids, and we introduced them to the idea of creative thinking. And I think being able, I did it with, I think they were 5 or 6 year olds, but it goes all the way up until 15, 16. And the thing that you notice the most is when you're that age, that thought process is not limited. It's just such a big expansive list of ideas, and then actually some of them are pretty good. So having those mentorship programs within schools, I think, is actually really, really important, and being able to have people within different fields. So if you're an architect, if you're an engineer, if you're anything within the built environment, being able to go into these schools once a week for a couple of weeks actually makes a big difference in how the younger people actually look at what they want to do in the world and how they can impact the world. So being able to create those kinds of programs tailored back to sort of art, and that helps you improve as well as a leader, because you're showcasing and sharing what you've learned and sort of giving that knowledge back as well.
It's a really good example. Thanks, Salah. So we've had a couple of questions, again, looking forward to the future. There's one here from Tom G, who says, young people are at the pointy end of London's affordability crisis. I think we probably all agree with that. Yep. How do we stop London becoming a city with no young people in 100 years? So yeah, a nice, easy question. And again, let's say, look, we're talking here about the future. We're talking about, you might have a magic wand that you can wave in terms of policy. What might that look like in terms of making sure we do still have whether it's young people, whether it's families still living in the City of London? Go for it, Fred.
Sort of an idea for that. As a young person in London, I don't know whether it's the same for everyone else here, but it's every young person who moves to London has to go and live either with an auntie, an uncle, or a cousin, or a friend for the first, 2 months or something, and then you move into extortionately priced rental properties, which are going to be probably quite horrible, maybe living in a warehouse or something. But I think that kind of, if you want young people in London, you either need to have affordable rent within London, or you need to have a good enough transport and a fun enough, interesting enough place that you can transport people from the surrounding areas. But I think, the rental thing would be the main one. A fairly radical and probably, I imagine from a money point of view, not possible idea was to have the state own all property in London, and they would be the leaders in making sure that rent was affordable, making sure that the retrofits happened where they needed to, and that all new developments became something that, rather than for monetary gain, they were built with sustainable aspirations.
Excellent. Emma, anything to add?
I suppose, I think if you look at kind of like what your biggest expenditure is at the moment, mine every month would be the rent that I pay. So I would say that in terms of making me want to stay in London in the future, having that kind of like security to know that rents aren't going to keep going up and that they are going to either stabilise or come down would probably be the kind of biggest draw to stay, because that's where you might start to look at other cities, say Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds. They have that city appeal, but if you can rent a way nicer flat for half the cost, then especially now with remote working, you could keep your job here and move elsewhere. So I think that would probably be my biggest change.
Yeah, and I think a really important point, we heard this morning, I think, first thing about the impact of housing or lack thereof it on productivity. And I think actually the example, again, around the amount of money that goes into housing, but actually time that might be spent commuting from, the depths of, what is barely even London anymore into the centre, and again, the impact that has. There's been a question here which I think actually serves as quite a nice closing remarks from each person question, which is that the next Gen committee, getting confusing here, are probably in secondary school right now. What is the biggest change in London that you'd like them to inherit from you? So let's say they might be sitting here in 5 to 10 years' time-ish. What might we like to have changed by the time that they get here? So I'm going to, because we just heard from Emma, I'm going to begin with Ala. Unless anyone else is literally leaping to go and wants to go, and I'll come back to Ala.
I don't mind going.
Go on, Lauren, go for it.
I think for me it would be having a safe place, so where they felt very safe walking around at night or just travelling, and then being able to travel safely, and it's a connected city, and they feel like safe in work from like what you said, having a voice, but also just safe generally. I think I'd like to see that, and them to feel just generally safe in all aspects.
Brilliant, thank you. Fred?
I think it feeds back to what I was saying earlier about it can be frustrating sometimes having standards that we've put a lot of effort into and there's a consensus on that they are the right way forward, and we still build buildings which don't achieve those standards. So it would be nice for the next gen committee to not have to push that decision, but to just be picking up from this is the baseline, and we can make excellent buildings which are already achieve incredible standards, but you work upwards from the middle rather than working upwards from the bottom.
Really well put. I really like that as an example. Evie?
I think linking back to my opening point, it will be equal opportunity for those young people. So irrespective of their background, what school they've gone to, they will have the information that they need to make an informed decision about the particular career choice that they want to go into. So that equal opportunity piece.
I'm going to go down to Emma, and then before I finish up at the end.
I'm going to be a real transport planner about this, but I think somewhere where there's been a complete redistribution of the street space that we have available, so car is not king. People are walking, cycling more. There's just a complete kind of shift in how we have that sort of small-scale movement within our city.
Brilliant, and probably some interesting links there to the point about safety that Lauren
massively.
raised as well. James?
Yeah, being honest, kind of building on both points Emma and also Evie raised as well. I think it's definitely a case of kind of keeping connected, and that's not just myself from getting to central London to work. I think it's also the ability to everyone can meet. People don't feel isolated, especially it might also kind of start to address the rental where everyone's a bit further away from London, but it's having that really easy, well-connected. You look at other cities with 24-hour transport links, it's having that ability where even though you might live in a different part of London, you can still stay connected to everyone and you don't feel isolated, and giving everyone that accessibility. So I'd probably say that would be the main one.
Brilliant, and I love the emphasis that you've had. It's really nice continuity about accessibility is something that's both about the physicality in terms of transport, but actually that ability to connect and what that might mean in terms of people as well. I think it's really good. Anna?
I hope that the next gen have it easier in terms of being able to collaborate with those within the industry and outside of the industry, and find their voice and find it easy to find their voice to be able to make decisions that will impact the future generation after that. But I think, as everyone said on this table, connectivity, both literally and physically, is sort of, I think, the thing that we'd really want to push with the next gen that comes after us.
Fantastic, thank you. I think it was whoever submitted that question. Thank you, because I think that ended things really nicely. Before we close, what I do want to do is return back to the question that I asked at the beginning of the session, which was, how do you feel about the future of London? So I'm going to launch that question again, and I'd be interested to see if we have any movement. Whilst to give a couple of minutes to do that, I just want to say thank you to all the panellists. Again, I might be a bit biased. I thought that was fantastic. It personally makes me feel a bit more optimistic about the future. And actually, I think, so much in terms of some really practical points, from Fred, particularly around, we have some of the technologies, we have the standards we need, is how we implement them. I think lots of the points about how the built environment in which we operate reflects our ability to collaborate as well, and those links between the two. And I think that ongoing point about the diversity of voices that we have in the room being so important, not just for the sake of diversity, but actually when it comes to learning, when it comes to solving problems, the more experiences and voices we have represented, the better position we're going to be in when we're looking ahead to the next 100 years. Okay, so the results are in. Optimistic, we are now up to 67%, which is a 10% increase on where we were at the beginning, which I think we will take as a modest victory, not that it's a competition. And those who are feeling pessimistic, interestingly, has increased by 2%. So the swing has been from the neutral, which I'm not quite sure, what that tells us. I'm no John Curtis, but I think that we are now hitting almost 70%. As a couple more of those votes come in, is definitely a good place to be ending on. So I'd just like to thank the panellists, if we could all do in the customary fashion. Just to close this session, we are going to be hearing from Zamzam Ibrahim, who is a climate justice campaigner and is an actual UN advisor, not just pretending by sitting at desks like this. She's going to be up on the stage very shortly, just after a short video that we'll be showing from Gardiner and Theobald. Thank you very much.
By championing the next generation of leaders, we ensure they're able to learn the skills needed to build today for a better tomorrow.
You have to be thinking about all the ideas of community, access, sustainability obviously is massively high on the political, public and the construction agenda at the moment.
I mean, the future of the city and the industry is in the hands of the next generation. There's only so much that we can do if we continue delivering what we're doing in the same way.
We're facing some pretty existential challenges as an industry in the built environment. You know, the climate emergency is a huge challenge for all of us, and the reality is we're not going to be able to solve it without having the best people in the industry.
The skills that I think are important for young people to build a better future are things like resilience, being able to adapt to an ever-changing environment, especially at the pace that technology is advancing at the moment. I also think it's really important to kind of show leadership skills that are inclusive, so making sure that you're adapting your way of leading a team in order to suit each of the different types of people that you might be leading.
My favourite thing about being a surveyor is being able to go on site and to be able to see a project from start to finish and how it grows out of the ground.
I describe myself as a change maker because I have the opportunity to see some of the challenges that we face in the industry, and I've also been given the opportunity to help address those.
I've been a mentor for 15 years now, giving back to our ICS colleague around the world. The reward that you get by helping people as a way of giving back to the community is something that you can't describe.
It's really important for the industry to be supporting apprenticeships because it just gives that variety or diversity into different routes into the industry.
I think it's really important for young people to get involved with G&T's Next Gen programme, to see beyond just your kind of small project. You don't often get to see the kind of wider impact of that building, so how it affects the rest of the city and making sure that you're actually feeding into the kind of wider, bigger picture.
Hello everyone, how are we all doing? It's a bit of radio silence, not what I'm used to. Hi everyone. Thank you. I know it's towards the end of the day and you've probably had a really busy day with lots of speakers, lots of engaging, a lot of thinking about what the future looks like, which can be exhausting, but actually really exciting to be here and actually very much enjoyed the last panel discussion. As a northerner myself, who spends a lot of time in London and lives in London, we often think about what the future looks like for us as a collective. But first, let me start by introducing myself. I'm Zamzam Ibrahim. I am a young climate activist, but before even that, I'm the daughter of Somali refugees who fled the civil war in Somalia in the 80s. I was born in Sweden. I grew up in the UK. I came here at the age of 9 years old. And what makes my story maybe significant to myself, there's a saying that says the insignificant is so significant in Somali proverb. But so Somalia is a country that is seen as a fragile land within the context of the civil war and the economic crisis that it's gone through. But I come from a long line of farmers. My father's land were a community and a tribe that essentially always self-sustained itself. An ecosystem that existed in a way where the communities all played a role, and essentially that communities were always able to self-sustain themselves. In 2011, one of the worst ever droughts hit Somalia. And the devastation in land resulted in essentially half of their ability to be able to plant crops going completely disarray. And so what happened is an ecosystem is disrupted. And stay with me here, ecosystems are important. And so when that ecosystem was disrupted, it meant that that community themselves, and I talk about this community, it's my tribe, it's the land that I come from. When that ecosystem is disrupted, it disrupts everything, because then it means that the farmers can't grow crops, and the educators can't educate, and there is an effect that hits the entire community, where actually they then need to think about new ways to sustain themselves. Now, some of those impacts have quite literally translated in the way in which we talk about building communities and the future of London, as we discussed. And I think it's interesting that often, even in utopian dreams, we limit our dreams of what can be and what can be possible. And I tell you that as an ecosystem to kind of understand, the United Nations predict that by 2050, there'll be 20 billion climate refugees. And to put that into context, there was a report that found that in 2020, there's about 20 million climate refugees. So contextually, that is a hell of a lot more. And why do I bring that to our conversation? I think one of the things we know, we understand, is that the climate crisis is a global crisis. And also, we live in a world now where everything is so intrinsically linked that we can't think about solving issues in London, within our boroughs, within our communities, without thinking about it from a collective and global perspective. And so when I talk about ecosystems and building systems that are able to sustain itself and link to itself, we need to really think about the bigger picture. I was very fortunate to become the president of the National Union of Students back in 2018-19. And during that time, the UK climate strikers, there was young students on the grounds protesting every single Friday. And from that mobilization that happened quite literally across the country on a regular basis and actually continues until this day, we brought young people together and created the first ever climate education bill. And one of the panelists actually says something that I can 100% resonate with, is that young people have the ability to see and dream beyond walls that we essentially limit ourselves with. And one of the things that we do when we put the climate education bill together, which is actually the first ever bill written by young people, taken to Parliament by young people, one of the things that fascinated me was the ability to really think about what our future can look like and what do we need from a bill. And one of the things a young person said, and was included in the bill, is the importance of not just where in the environment which we learn in, but actually the importance of what we learn from the environment that we're in. And because we spoke about, because that was literally brought to us by a 12-year-old who was kind of frustrated in learning in classrooms that weren't reflective of the future that they envisioned for themselves, they questioned it. They said, well, actually, why can't we build schools that are actually self-sustaining? Why can't we have the ability to farm and to learn these useful skills within our own education systems? And that's how an entire, essentially work around retrofitting schools and building just sustainable practice, not just within the curricula, but also outside of the curricula, was developed into. And I think one of the things that we often bring ourselves to, and I'll kind of tie back to the values of this very conference itself, is that we often talk about society as if it's like this abstract idea. It was said on the stage, it's been said multiple times, and we talk about how do we influence society, how do we push society, how do we work within society? We are society. And we need to stop setting this idea that like society is this abstract idea that we are so far removed from and we don't have any control over. In reality, we are the ones who set norms by making decisions. And to me, a leader is individuals that are not afraid to make mistakes, are actually willing to make mistakes as long as they're moving towards a just and sustainable place, as long as they're moving towards making a difference for the greater good. And sometimes, I mean, actually, almost always, it's not going to look like the result that you need. And that's incredibly important to recognize. But tying back to what are values and why they're important, and I thought it would be, if you would indulge me a little bit, and get a little philosophical with me. Stay with me, I know it's been a long day, but it's not been a long day for me. So what are values? What are they to us, right? Like, what do they mean to us? And why are they important? What makes them so important? And do they differ from person to person? How do our values influence our decision making? And why do they influence our decision making? What role do values play in ethical and moral dilemmas? And are there any universal values? And thinking about that from like a cultural and societal perspective when we move from place to place. So if our values are a set of beliefs and standards that we've set for ourselves, given we don't really set anything for ourselves because we're completely influenced by the society in which we grow up in and the environment that we grow up in, nature versus nurture, that's another debate. But if we're talking about if values are set by ourselves, right, and they're essentially what leads us as we step into the world as professionals, and as for the young people as future professionals to shape the world that we want to see, then surely it plays a very, very, very important role in the crisis that we face now, the climate crisis. And I don't need to explain to you again and again, and I'm sure many of you are well-versed with the stats of how terrifyingly the climate crisis is impacting not just countries in the global south, but like our very country, our very land, and actually just thinking about the impact it's had in local communities, even within London. So even though we're facing extreme weathers, rising sea levels, and crazy wildfires, we are the only ones that are able to make a difference within the work that we do. And our values have to play a massive and a very important part in that. So our next generations that are designing the next eco-friendly building, the planning a sustainable community, you need to think what's guiding those decisions, and are those values correct? Are those values social justice? Is it built within sustainability? Does equity part in the heart of it? And thinking about it, who gets hit by the climate crisis the hardest is often almost the most marginalized and the most deprived. And so we have to consistently become champions of justice and make sure that everyone, no matter where they are, their economic status, have access to clean air, clean water, and green spaces. So our buildings can't just be these projects that are futuristics, that look cool, that are spick and span. They also need to be responsible and respectful to the environment. This means that we have to be sustainable in the materials that we use, reduce the waste, and cut down on our carbon footprint. And we have the power to make that choice and be bold in our actions. But here's the deal. The reality is this isn't a solo mission, and we need to really work collectively and together. Collaboration is key in achieving any of this. So I would encourage you to talk to your fellow professionals and engage with communities and really listen to their needs. Because justice and sustainability are a team sport, not individual players. So I want to leave you with some call to actions. Like Malcolm X once said, the future belongs to those who prepare for it today. So firstly, I want to ask you to take a moment to really think about your values. What are they, and what drives them, and where do they stand, and what do you stand for? And I say that because the reality is that all of us have a very biased view and understanding of the world that we live in. And to build a just and collective world, we need to be able to understand what do we need as a collective rather than what do I need as an individual. And really ask ourselves and move away from this individualist society that we're more or less very much built on and move into a collective way of thinking. Secondly, get innovative. The climate crisis needs really creative solutions. We need to think outside the box and not be afraid to colour outside the lines. And like I said earlier, be okay with making mistakes, to relearn and unlearn and relearn again. And lastly, connect and collaborate. Work with local communities, work with people, talk to each other. The most important thing, and often we forget, is collaboration isn't a consultation. It isn't a survey. It isn't sitting down with a person asking them what they want or a community what they want. It is about collectively working together. It's about really collaborating and bringing ideas also to the table and being a part of that, being a part of building something. And I hope together we can build a future that has our values at the very heart of it. And I hope that our values don't just remain words on a page, and they become the very foundation of the world we seek to create. So with that, let's get to work. Thank you.